Hello students, hope you're doing well. So this lesson is going to be on part writing and the rules of part writing. In the Barron's book, the version that I'm using, it's chapter 8. And so on the huskybands.edublogs.org, if you want to follow along, just go to the AP tab and click the chapter 8 read, and I would suggest having that up while you listen to this little video lecture. So first, before we get started, this is considered material from the AP Unit 4, which that's the College Board's unit. And so this will be tested on the AP exam this year, even with the updated kind of shortened test due to the virus stuff. So, part writing, what is it? Let's try to define it first. At its base kind of definition is you're going to create a figured bass, right? It's an expansion of figured bass, which you're already used to doing some, but you're not used to creating all four parts. So you're going to now write a soprano, an alto, a tenor, and the bass part will be provided for you on the figured bass example. There's also going to be another part writing example, and we'll get to later, where they don't give you the bass part, but they give you the Roman numerals with the inversions, and then you create all four voices. But we're going to start with the part writing off of the figured bass, which you're creating three voices, the top three. In the part writing, the soprano is always the melody, and then you're going to fill in the alto and the tenor, and we'll talk more about that later. So just following the Barron's book here, rule number 1, remember about the stems. The soprano and the tenor stems are going to go up off of the note head, and the alto and the bass stems are going to go down off the note head, always. Know the range of all your voices. Soprano is C4 to G5, and tenor is C3 to G4. Now, I grouped those together because it's C and G, C and G, so it's kind of easy to remember, soprano and tenor. The alto and bass, G3 is alto to C5, and then bass is G2 to C4. So those are, alto and bass are G to C. You just have to kind of remember what octave they're in. It is possible to occasionally take the soprano to an A or an A flat. I just wouldn't overdo it. But if you needed to get those notes, I wouldn't go above A. You could occasionally use A flat above the staff there and A. All right, so rule number 2. The bass in the figured bass examples, the bass is going to be given to you. When you write your melody, and that is your soprano line, always, the melody is always in the soprano. The first goal is to try to write the melody of the soprano in contrary motion to the bass. So in other words, in opposite motion. So, if your bass starts low and kind of climbs up and then drops back down, I would try to compose your soprano that starts high, kind of descends, and then jumps back up for maybe the final note, so that they work opposite each other. We're going to get to why exactly here in just a moment, but try to write always contrary motion if you can. It's also okay for the soprano part to be a little jumpy. It doesn't have to be super stepwise, right? A lot of melodies, really memorable melodies, have jumps and leaps in them. So now don't go wild with it, but it's okay to have jumps and leaps and skips and things in the melody. We're going to have our alto and tenor part as boring as possible, and that's why I use the term we're going to fill in the alto and the tenor part. And I sing tenor. This is not about, you're not composing for anything to be sung. You're composing to show that you know how to do this technique, all right? So you're not trying to sell anything to a publishing company. So you're not trying to make altos and tenors happy in the world. Nobody's going to really sing this. So just trust me, make the alto and tenor as boring and static and flat as possible. Rule number 3, this is about motion. There's different types of motion. We've already mentioned contrary motion. That's where two lines move opposite, so one goes up, the other goes down. That is the best motion whenever you're creating, especially a melodic line, but that's the best motion because you're not going to break some part writing rules that we're going to mention in a minute. You can also have oblique motion. That's where like one line would stay the same, like maybe the soprano would go A, stay on the same note to an A, where the bass would go C to F, right? So one is moving, the other is staying the same. That's oblique motion. Similar motion is where they're moving, the two lines are moving similar to each other, like they both move up or they both move down, but maybe the intervals are a bit different. So that maybe the soprano moves, I don't know, maybe up, a minor third while the bass moves a perfect fourth or something. So that's similar motion. And then you have parallel motion, which is where they're moving exactly the same distance, which is you want to avoid that at all cost, because when you write parallel motion, even accidentally, especially accidentally, you're more likely to break the part writing rules that they want you to not break. So now, kind of on to the do's and don'ts. This is rule 4. Crossing voices. This is easy to kind of accidentally have happen, especially between alto and tenor. A cross voice is where you would have one voice, like the tenor voice, which is supposed to be below the alto, singing a pitch that is higher than the alto. So, and it's easiest between alto and tenor because they're on different staffs, right? They're on different systems there. So, you might accidentally, let's say you write your tenor note up to like an E, which is fine, but make sure your alto note is not singing below that bottom line in the treble clef, because it might not look on the page that they're crossed, but when you would go to a piano and actually play that part, one part would be singing higher than the other. So keep the voices where they belong. Overlap is about not sending, for instance, like the soprano. If the soprano and alto are singing, let's say like an A to an F, which is thirds, in the very next chord, you wouldn't want the soprano to jump down to an E on the bottom of the staff, even though that is in their range. What you've done is, in consecutive chords, you've crossed the line where the alto was. And what that does is it confuses the ear. The soprano needs to be not only above the alto, which it would be, but the line needs to maintain. So this is all about going from chord to chord. Now maybe later you could have the soprano sing that E, as long as the previous chord, the alto was a good bit lower. Hopefully that makes sense. And then parallel motion, this is when, as mentioned in my previous rule, where they're moving the exact distance. In this rule, parallel octaves and parallel fifths are the big no-nos, the big don't do. Parallel octaves would be, for instance, if you had the soprano moving from C to D, and then down in the tenor, or even the bass, or even the alto, all right, but another voice moving C to D as well. That would be parallel octaves. And that, again, it makes, what it does is it masks the identity of that voice. You want them to be 4 separate lines, and when they mimic each other in that exact imitation, especially with parallel octaves, you're masking that identity. Parallel fifths are, and we're talking, of course, consecutive, so chord to chord, not doing parallel octaves or parallel fifths here. Parallel fifths are, if you were like bass to tenor, if you had a C to a G, and actually I have one right here, C to G, and then the very next chord you have F to C. This is this is a perfect fifth to a perfect fifth. Both the intervals of the perfect fifth were maintained. So that would be parallel fifths, which you would want to avoid. And I'll drop a video. I found a really great video on why parallel fifths are bad. And I'm put that link in the description so you can check that out if you're really getting picky about it. So now, I just want to say really quickly, because I get asked this every year, well, why can't we write that and blah, 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 blah. You can write that. If you're a composer, do whatever you want. Like Aaron Copland, for instance, wrote a lot of open fifths to create the sound that he wanted. But you're not a composer. You're an AP student taking the AP exam, and they want you to follow the rules of the 18th century, right? So we're talking 1700s. And the rules of the 18th century would have said no parallel octaves and parallel fifths. So again, you're not a composer. You are trying to pass this AP exam and show them that you can follow by the rules that they've given you. So play along. Rule number 5, spacing. Each voice, except for the bass, should be within an octave of each other. So soprano to alto, the notes should be no more than an octave apart. Alto to tenor, the same. The tenor to the bass part, the good news is it doesn't matter. So soprano to alto and alto to tenor, don't worry about like soprano to tenor, right? But soprano to alto, alto to tenor should be no greater than the interval of an octave. And there's some examples of some mistakes in the spacing about this rule on the PDF, which you can kind of see above, right on the page that's above rule number 6. Okay, so rule 6 and 7, I'm kind of combining. And this talks about doubling and then tendency tones. So first, doubling. We've talked a little bit in class about this already, where it's okay to double the root of a chord. It strengthens a chord. If you have to double another chord member, the 5th is the next member to double. If you have to double the 3rd, it is okay, but it should kind of be your last resort, and only if you, with good reason, only if you have to. Why would you ever have to double a chord member? Why couldn't you just have them all? Well, for one, you have 4 voices, and in a triad, you only have 3 notes, right? So you're going to have to double some note. In a 7th chord, you might have to double a note to avoid breaking a part writing rule, right? So if you look and by writing 4 voices, you're creating a parallel 5th or parallel octave, you can leave a chord member out that would make the rule, make you not break the rule, and then it would, as long as it followed kind of our doubling, right? Double the root first, the 5th second, and the 3rd only, with good reason, it would still be acceptable. So now to tendency tones. What is a tendency tone? And this is a rule, you don't want to double a tendency tone. A tendency tone is a note that has to resolve a certain way. And you get this mostly in the dominant to tonic chord progression. So like if you were going from a 5 to a 1. And if you look here, I set this up in F major, so 1 flat in the key signature. This is C, G, B flat, and E natural, right? This is a 5-7 chord. This is a 5-7 chord moving to a root position 1 chord, right? F, C, A, F. And we've got a perfect authentic cadence in the key of F. The tendency tones are always going to be your leading tone, right? So the key of F in a dominant chord, your leading tone always in the key of F is E natural, right? It's this note right here. And you know just from the stability chart we talked about of notes, that E natural wants to resolve up a half step to the home note, which is F. So let's see if I can switch colors here. In a dominant chord, your leading tone, which is scale degree 7, will want to resolve up to 1. So this note going up to 1. You would not want to have the soprano sing an E and then jump to another note. There are occasionally exceptions, but don't freak out about that. But for what we're doing, make that E resolve to F. So 7 to 1, and this could be in any key, right? Your scale degree 7 in a dominant chord is resolving up to scale degree 1. The other tendency tone in this chord, because it's a 7th chord, and it will always be this way with the 7th chord, is the 7th of the 7th chord. So this chord is built on C, right? So the 5-7 chord is C, E, G, B flat. So the B flat is the 7th, right? Root, 3rd, 5th, the 7th. The 7th of the 7th chord will always want to resolve down a half step to what is scale degree 3 in the key. So this is scale degree 4 in the key, right? B flat in the key of F wants to resolve down to an A flat, to the A. And what you can tell is they resolve to their half steps, right? E up to F, B flat down to A. This is very normal. I put both of them in the top staff so to make it easier to see. So the alto is singing the B flat, and they're going to resolve down the half step to an A. So your tendency tones are scale degree 7 in the dominant chord, and then the 7th of the 7th chord, and they resolve kind of in opposite directions. Now the reason why you wouldn't want to ever double a tendency tone is because they have to resolve a certain way. And if I doubled an E, like if I had an E to F in the soprano and I doubled the E in the tenor, it would have to also resolve to F. And by doubling a tendency tone, I've broken a part writing rule, and that is parallel octaves, right? So if you double the tendency tone, you're always going to have, if you've resolved it correctly, you're always going to create parallel octaves for yourselves. So let me play this progression for you here on the piano quickly, just so you can hear it. So we have a C and G, then a B flat, right? That wants to resolve to, yep, that sounded pretty natural and pretty normal. You could hear the tendency tone going here, and that tendency tone dropping there. So you can hear how those tendency tones want to resolve. Now, I did this on purpose. Hopefully, I mentioned already about the parallel fifths. So let's say that you wrote this progression and you realized that you have your tendency tones resolving the way they should, but you realize when you get to the end, you're like, oh crap, I wrote parallel fifths. How can I fix this? The way that I would fix it is to leave a chord member out, right? And so what I would do is I would leave this first chord the way it is and then adjust the second chord. So the problem is really with the tenor, especially if you can't, you're not wanting to adjust the bass, right? You want to leave it in root position. If you adjust the bass at all, you're making something not in root position. If you want to leave it in root position, adjust the tenor part. So the trouble is that we have a perfect fifth moving to a perfect fifth, which is parallel fifths. So the trouble is with the tenor note. What I would do, and we've talked about this in class, is we talked about doubling notes, but we've also mentioned about you can leave notes out of a chord. The most common left out note, especially in a triad, is going to be the fifth of the chord, which the tenor happens to be singing here on this C, right? F major, F, A, C, F, right? So leaving this C out is perfectly fine. Of course, the tenor has to sing something, so what I would do to fix your part writing problem here is to double the third. And we mentioned that doubling the third only with good reason. This would be with good reason. Now you would say, well, there's only two notes in this chord, F's and A's. But the interesting thing is that your ear is still going to hear it as major because you have to have the root note, and the third of the chord is telling you your quality. The fifth of the chord is just there for stability. So you're still going to hear it, and I'll play it. I don't have a pedal or anything, excuse me. So back to this, right? And now to here, right? So instead of the bass and tenor going, those really striding parallel fifths, goes, progression at all. Sounds fine. Your ear is still going to hear that final chord as major, and you have resolved things correctly, and you've corrected for your parallel fifths. So my next lesson, the next couple of lessons, we're going to put these rules into practice. So stay tuned for the next video. We're going to do an example of part writing in major, and then I'll do a second, or I guess a third now, video where we do a part writing in a minor key, and we can go through those. So hope this has helped clear some things up. Good luck. If you have questions, send me an email or drop some comments down below. Thanks, guys. We'll see you.